My three kids stood beside the coat rack with their plates still empty, quietly watching their cousins enjoy second helpings of prime rib nearly 40 feet away. My sister gently smoothed the tablecloth in front of her as if she were straightening a royal crown. Then, with that same polished smile she'd been giving me ever since we were little girls, she said, "They can eat after the guests are finished." At the head of the table sat my father, wearing the birthday crown my daughter had lovingly made from construction paper and glitter glue. He simply nodded. He never looked at me. He never looked at my children. He picked up his fork and went right back to cutting into his steak like nothing had happened. That was it. I quietly walked over to the coat rack. I grabbed 3 tiny coats. One with a broken zipper I still hadn't been able to replace. One nearly 2 sizes too big because it had been handed down. And one with a hole in the pocket where my son always shoved his thumb whenever he felt nervous. I helped my youngest slip into her coat, then said loudly enough for everyone in that private dining room to hear, "We'll eat at home, where nobody has to earn their dinner." Nobody stopped us. Nobody followed us into the parking lot. As I buckled my son into his car seat, my hands shook so badly I could barely snap the buckle into place. Right then, I made myself a promise. What I didn't know was that less than 2 years later, keeping that promise would cost my sister everything she'd spent an entire decade building. And it would all begin with one plain manila folder she never imagined I'd discover. My name is Linnea Thorne. But before I tell you what was inside that folder, you need to understand just how many years I'd spent being the daughter nobody ever planned around. I was 26 when my husband walked away. Trent Doyle didn't leave with shouting, slammed doors, or some huge blowout. Nah, he left the way some people do. Quietly. Little by little over the course of a year. Until one day half the closet sat empty. And a short note rested on the kitchen counter, saying he needed some space to figure things out. Turns out, he figured everything out 2 states away with a woman from his old job. For days after he left, I learned I was still pregnant with our 3rd child. I already had a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, another baby on the way, and only $180 sitting in my checking account. I didn't tell my family right away. Honestly, I already knew exactly how that conversation would go. I'd watched that same story play out in different parts of my life more times than I cared to count. My sister, Marguerite, had married into serious money. Her husband owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties. And from the moment she said "I do," wearing a wedding dress, that cost more than my very first car. Something quietly changed in the way our parents looked at the 2 of us. It wasn't openly cruel. Not at first. It was subtler than that. It showed up in little things, like the way our mother, before she passed, would casually say, "Well, Marguerite's family has a lot going on." Anytime she wanted an excuse to spend Tuesday visiting her grandchildren instead of driving an extra 20 minutes to see mine. Or the way my father, Desmond, would spend several minutes asking Marguerite's kids detailed questions about piano recitals, soccer tournaments, and every little achievement. Then turn to my children with nothing more than, "You kids keeping busy?" By the time my divorce was finalized, I was renting a tiny 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. My daughters, Faye and Della, shared one bedroom, while my son, Beckett, slept in a crib squeezed into the corner of mine. Every morning, I worked at a medical billing office. 3 nights a week, I clocked in at a warehouse doing inventory. Because raising 3 children on one income wasn't really a plan. It was a math problem that never seemed to work out. Meanwhile, my sister was busy remodeling her kitchen island for the 2nd time in 4 years, posting cheerful photos of family game nights in a living room that was bigger than my entire apartment. One Christmas, especially, is burned into my memory. Beckett was still just a baby. Marguerite's children tore into presents that filled nearly half the living room, a brand new gaming console, matching bicycles, and a dollhouse so massive it looked like an actual piece of furniture. Then my father handed my girls one wrapped package, a single set of coloring books, for both of them to share. With a warm smile that somehow made it hurt even more, he said, You girls don't need as much. You're not spoiled like your cousins. I didn't say a word. I convinced myself it was easier that way. Making a scene over coloring books would only reinforce whatever silent opinion they already had about me, that I was bitter, that I couldn't move on, that I always made things harder than they had to be. So I smiled too. I thanked him. Then I drove home wondering exactly when I'd accepted becoming the daughter who was simply expected to settle for less without ever questioning it. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. Not once did I ever ask my family for money. Not when my car's transmission failed. And I spent 5 straight months taking 2 buses to work. Not when Beckett needed an ear specialist and the copays nearly wiped me out. Not even when Della's 2nd grade teacher quietly pulled me aside to ask whether things were okay at home. Because my daughter had started bringing crackers to school in a sandwich bag. And refused to explain why. I never asked anyone for help. I just kept showing up. Kept working. Kept telling my kids that love wasn't measured by a price tag. Even while I watched my sister's family receive invitations that somehow never included mine. Then came my father's 70th birthday. For once, he called me himself. That almost never happened. Normally, Marguerite handled those conversations for him. I want all my grandkids there, Lynn, he said. Every single one. I remember standing in my little kitchen with the phone tucked between my shoulder and ear while stirring a pot of the cheapest pasta I could find. For the first time in years, something inside me finally loosened. All my grandkids. Those 4 words meant everything. I told my children we were going to Grandpa's big birthday celebration. Della spent 3 evenings making him a birthday crown from construction paper and glitter glue because she couldn't afford to buy him a present and wanted to create one with her own hands instead. Faye carefully picked out her nicest dress, the one she'd worn 2 Easters earlier that was already getting a little short. 5-year-old Beckett practiced saying, "Happy birthday, Grandpa," over and over like he was rehearsing for a school play. We drove 90 minutes to the private dining room Marguerite had reserved at an upscale steakhouse with crisp white tablecloths and a maitre d' who looked at my children's hand-me-down coats like they'd wandered into the wrong place. Honestly, that should have been my first red flag. The moment we walked inside and I spotted the seating chart, my stomach sank. There were only 2 tables. The large table by the windows held elegant place cards written in gold script. Marguerite. Her husband, Preston. Sylvie. My father. Several of Dad's longtime golf buddies. The second table sat off to the side, nearly pushed against the coat closet. Instead of elegant place cards, it had 3 paper name tags taped onto plastic placemats. Faye. Della. Beckett. There wasn't even a place card for me. It was like everyone had already assumed I'd just stand wherever there was space. I kept telling myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe they simply ran out of room. Maybe I was reading too much into it after years of feeling like the family's afterthought. So I sat my children at their little table and went looking for my sister. She was directing the waitstaff with the calm confidence of someone completely used to being in charge. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone light. "I think there might have been a mix-up with the seating. My kids are kind of tucked away back there." Marguerite didn't even bother looking up from the seating chart she was holding. "It's not a mix-up," she replied casually. "The main table is for immediate family and Dad's close friends. There just wasn't enough room for everyone." "Their immediate family, Marguerite." Finally, she looked at me. There it was again. That same smile I'd memorized over the last 30 years. Patient. Polite. And just condescending enough to let me know exactly where I stood. "It's fine," she said with a shrug. "The kids' table is right there. They'll be served after the main course goes out." I wish I could tell you I pushed back harder in that moment. I didn't. Not yet. I went back to my children and quietly took my seat. Then I watched server after server carry beautiful plates to the main table. A perfectly cooked rack of lamb for my father. Steaks for Preston and Sylvie. An enormous seafood tower for Marguerite and her husband. Meanwhile, my kids sat there with nothing but empty placemats, watching their cousins eat. 5-year-old Beckett tugged gently on my sleeve and asked in that sweet, Innocent voice, only little kids have mommy. When is it our turn? That's when Marguerite said the words I'll never forget. Loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Loud enough that two of Dad's golf buddies glanced over with obvious discomfort. They can eat when the guests are done. Guests. She called my children guests. At their own grandfather's birthday party. At a celebration they'd been personally invited to. I looked at my father. You have to understand what I was hoping for in that split second. I wasn't expecting a speech. I wasn't asking him to embarrass anyone. I just wanted one sentence. One simple sentence telling his other daughter she was wrong. Instead, he nodded. He picked up his fork. And he went right back to eating his steak as though nothing had happened. As though his own grandchildren weren't sitting 6 feet away with empty plates. And confused little faces. I've replayed that single nod more times than I could ever count. It wasn't anger that made me stand up. It was clarity. 31 years of quiet comparisons. Small insults. Subtle exclusions. All of it suddenly came together. That nod gave every one of those moments a shape. Without saying a word, it told me exactly where my children ranked. I stood. Walked over to the coat rack. Picked up Faye's oversized hand-me-down coat. Then Della's coat with the broken zipper. Then Beckett's little jacket with the hole in the pocket, where he always tucked his thumb whenever he got nervous. One by one, I helped each of my children put their coats on. The entire room watched. Nobody spoke. It was that strange kind of silence people fall into when they know something wrong is happening. But nobody wants to be the first person to acknowledge it. Then I looked around the room and said calmly, "We'll eat at home. Where nobody has to earn their dinner." I didn't yell. I didn't slam a door. I didn't make a scene. Not there, anyway. The tears didn't come until we were inside the car. As I buckled everyone in, Beckett, still too young to understand what had really happened, looked up at me and asked, "Can we come back for the birthday cake later?" My heart nearly shattered. I smiled anyway. "We'll have our own cake, buddy." Then I drove the entire 90 minutes home gripping the steering wheel. So tightly my hands ached. By the time we got back, it was almost 10 o'clock at night. I put 3 frozen waffles into the toaster. That was dinner. Because that was all we had. Now, here's what happened over the next few weeks. I told you about the manila folder. But before we get there, you need to understand the silence that came first. Nobody called. Not my father. Not Marguerite. Not even one of the golf buddies, who had watched 3 children sit through an entire dinner with empty plates. For days later, I finally heard something. It wasn't an apology. It was a text message from my Aunt Ronnie. She had forwarded something from a family group chat. I'd quietly been removed from some time after the party. According to Marguerite, I'd thrown a fit. She claimed I'd embarrassed Dad on his special day by storming out with my children. Her version of events made it sound like I'd completely overreacted over nothing more than a simple seating issue. 11 days after his own birthday, I finally managed to reach my father. He let out one long, tired sigh. The kind people use when they think they're the ones being inconvenienced. "Lynn," he said, "it was one dinner. You didn't have to make it into such a big deal. One dinner." Those 2 words told me everything. I quietly hung up. And I never called him again. I'd love to tell you I handled the months that followed with grace. Truth is, mostly I handled them with exhaustion. Money got even tighter. My landlord raised the rent by $40 a month. That doesn't sound like much. But when you're already choosing between paying the electric bill or buying new shoes for a growing 7-year-old, $40 feels huge. I picked up a 4th warehouse shift every week. Most days, I stopped eating lunch. Not because I wanted to. Just because I'd already decided my children eating well mattered more than I did. Faye was 10 by then. She started noticing things kids her age should never have to notice. One evening, she found me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills. She didn't ask questions. She didn't complain. She simply sat beside me in silence. Like she already understood there weren't any words that could fix what we were facing. There was one week in January that I still think about more than any other. I was exactly $230 short on rent. I remember that number perfectly because I must have done the math 40 different times that week, rearranging bills in my head like puzzle pieces that just refused to fit. By then, I'd already sold the only piece of jewelry I owned that had any real value. My grandmother's ring. I took it to a pawn shop 2 towns away, so nobody who knew me would see me walk through those doors. Afterward, I sat alone in my car in the parking lot and cried harder than I had since Trent left. It wasn't really about the ring. It was about finally realizing just how close I was to the edge. One bad week, one unexpected expense, and I'd be having a conversation with my children about where we were going to sleep. Not once did it cross my mind to call my father. Honestly, that says more about our relationship than anything else ever could. The distance between us had grown so wide that asking him for help wasn't even an option in my mind. That same week, Della's second-grade teacher called and asked if I could come in for a meeting. I wasn't expecting it. She spoke gently, almost carefully. She told me Della had started bringing an extra sandwich bag filled with crackers to school every day. But she wasn't eating them. She was quietly hiding them inside her cubby. When her teacher asked why, my 7-year-old daughter simply said, "I just want to make sure we have extra, in case we run out of dinner." I sat there in that tiny plastic chair meant for little kids and felt something inside me break and rebuild itself at the exact same time. Driving home that afternoon, I made another promise. No matter what it took, no matter how many late nights, no matter how exhausted I became, I was going to find a way out of survival mode. Because I refused to let my children grow up carrying the same fear of scarcity I'd spent my own life carrying. The person who helped keep me standing that winter wasn't family. It was my landlord, a woman named Presley Judd. She owned the hardware store beneath our apartment and had watched my kids grow up running up and down those old wooden stairs. Presley was somewhere in her 60s. Sharp, observant, the kind of person who noticed when someone's lights stayed on past midnight 3 nights in a row, without ever making a big deal about it. She started leaving little things outside my apartment door. A grocery bag filled with clothes her niece had outgrown that happened to fit my girls. A casserole because she'd made too much. An extra loaf of homemade bread. She never expected thanks. Never brought it up again afterward. One evening in February, I was carrying groceries upstairs with Beckett balanced on my hip, when Presley stopped me halfway up the stairwell. "You know," she said, "you don't have to carry all this like you're the only person who's ever had their world fall apart." I laughed. "At least I tried to." "Sure feels like I do," I admitted. She smiled kindly. Then she said something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. "Family isn't just the people who share your last name, Linnea." She paused. "It's the people who show up when there's nothing in it for them." At the time, I nodded. But I don't think I truly understood those words until much later. Presley slowly became the person I talked to whenever life got overwhelming. More importantly, she became the person who helped me see there might actually be a way out. She knew a local bookkeeper who needed part-time help entering financial records. It was work I could do from my own kitchen table after the kids had gone to bed. The pay was better than the warehouse. And for the first time in years, it challenged a part of my brain that had been sitting idle ever since before Beckett was born. I still remember that first week. 3 kids finally asleep upstairs. Me sitting alone after midnight with a second-hand laptop that had a cracked corner, staring at spreadsheets until my eyes burned. But something amazing happened. For the first time in years, I felt capable again. Not grateful for leftovers. Not relieved just to survive another month. Simply proud. Proud that I was actually good at something. And that someone was paying me fairly to do it. Within 4 months, words started spreading. One client mentioned me to another small business owner. Then another. Soon I had 2 more bookkeeping clients. 8 months later, without making a big announcement or posting about it online, I'd quietly built a small bookkeeping business of my own. 1 spreadsheet. 1 client. 1 late night at a time. The warehouse job was the first thing I quit. A while later, I left the medical billing office too. The day I realized my bookkeeping income had quietly surpassed both paychecks combined, I didn't celebrate with anything fancy. No expensive vacation. No shopping spree. I simply took my kids to a little diner 2 towns over. For the very first time, I told each of them, "Order anything you want." I didn't even glance at the prices. When the waitress smiled at Beckett and asked, "So, buddy, want a milkshake?" I answered before he even had the chance. "Absolutely." The look on his face. I'll carry that memory with me forever. I want to be honest, because this part matters just as much as everything before it. Rebuilding my life wasn't a straight road. Some months, client work slowed down. And I'd panic, wondering if everything I'd built was about to disappear. A few times, I even picked up part-time shifts again just to stay afloat. There were nights I looked at my daughter's report cards and felt guilty, because I still couldn't afford the gymnastics classes Della had wanted for over a year. But little by little, month after month, life became steadier. I stopped jumping every time an unknown number called, expecting another collections notice. I even started an emergency fund. It wasn't much at first, but I promised myself I wouldn't touch it unless I absolutely had to. The biggest change, though, was in my children. They finally began sleeping peacefully. No more quiet footsteps checking if the lights were still on. Somewhere inside, they had started believing we were going to be okay. Ironically, it was my bookkeeping business that eventually uncovered everything. One of my clients owned a used furniture consignment shop that regularly worked with Preston's dealership. While reconciling invoices one afternoon, I noticed several wire transfer confirmations had accidentally been attached to a reimbursement file. One name immediately caught my attention. Our mother, Eleanor Thorne. Then I saw the amounts. After Mom passed away, she'd left an education trust that was supposed to be divided equally between Marguerite's children and mine. I'd signed the paperwork years earlier, trusting the money would remain untouched until the kids reached adulthood. It hadn't. Over 3 years, small amounts had quietly been transferred out of the trust into an account connected to Preston's dealership expansion. The same expansion that paid for the kitchen remodel, the expensive birthday dinner, and the seafood tower my children never got to taste. At first, I hoped there was an innocent explanation. So I started checking everything. Old invoices, trust statements, transfer records, dealership documents. Every date matched. Every transfer followed the same pattern. This wasn't an accounting mistake. It was intentional. That night, after my children were asleep, I sat alone staring at the numbers on my laptop. For the first time, every painful memory finally made sense. Over the next few days, I printed every document that mattered and placed them inside a plain manila folder. Then I hid it in the bottom drawer of my desk beneath a stack of client files. I didn't tell anyone, not even Presley. 3 weeks later, I carried that folder into the office of Estate Attorney Dorian Voss. I laid it on his desk and quietly said, "I need you to tell me if I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing." Within a week, he gave me the answer I already knew deep down.